Hi folks, it's Mr. Asserson here. Wanted to talk to you today about the history of U.S.-China relations. We need to know the history so that we can know what we should be doing with China now. Should we be in conflict with them or should we be cooperating with them? There's military issues, there's economic issues, there's environmental issues. So the question is, should we be cooperating or should we be conflicting with them? And we have to know our history so that we can know how to make good decisions in the present. So the first thing we should know is that China has one of the most ancient civilizations on Earth. They've been a country for 5,000 years. They've had a stable government that's built roads and canals and obviously the Great Wall. They've invented all kinds of things that we use today, like coal and gunpowder and the compass. As well as things like umbrellas and paper. They've been a civilization with great cultural achievements as well, artistic achievements, religious and philosophical achievements like Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism. Well, Buddhism technically was invented in India, but it's been a very big part of Chinese culture. So when did China first meet the West? That's a question that needs to be answered. Western merchants, and by West I mean British, French, Dutch merchants, started showing up in China in the late 1700s. And you can see they had to travel a long ways to get there. When they got there, they were trading for goods that China had, such as porcelain, silk, and this item. Can you tell what that's an image of? It's an image from American history. Yes, that is the Boston Tea Party. So the European merchants loved tea from China, and the tea that was in the Boston Tea Party was actually from China. When the European merchants started trading for these goods in China, China didn't really want any goods from the Europeans. They thought the quality of the manufactured products from Europe was low, and so they would just trade at first with silver, but then the Chinese started making tons of money in this deal, and the Europeans were not making tons of money, so the Europeans started trading something else. And this other product that China started using is something that's in widespread use in America today. And it's a major, major problem in America. And that is drugs made from opium. There's an opioid crisis in America, drugs like heroin. The Trump administration just declared a national health crisis. But that's the drug that the European traders introduced to China. They started selling it. And by the 1830s, millions of Chinese were addicted to opium. So we're going to pause there for a second. So by the 1830s, there were millions of Chinese addicted to opium. And the government was not happy about this. And they tried to stop it, and they used force to stop the European merchants from selling opium. The British merchants asked their military to get involved, and the British Navy ended up starting a war, and it was called the Opium War. And the British Navy was superior to the Chinese Navy, so it was able to destroy the southern fleet of China. It also leveled a bunch of fortifications along the coast, and the British occupied several major cities. This was a humiliating defeat for the Chinese. The Chinese considered themselves to be superior to other people, and this was a case where they were defeated militarily and humiliated. As a result of the victory, the British said that the Chinese had to open up their country to trade, had to lower their tariffs, had to give the British an island, the island of Hong Kong, which was a major city, and also said that Westerners could not be tried for crimes in China. If a Westerner committed a crime, they could go to their home country to be tried. Now, that was in the 1839. In 1857, there's a second Opium War. The French, the Russians, and the US are involved in this war. The Western powers defeat the Chinese again. They march to Beijing, the capital, and they burn down the emperor's palace. There's a second round of humiliating terms that the Chinese have to sign in the treaty, including letting Westerners live in and travel around China, letting Christian missionaries come into China, and legalizing the opium trade. So as you can imagine, the Chinese were not impressed with how the Europeans had been treating them in these first contacts with the First Opium War and the Second Opium War. After those, by the way, there's a picture of the British fighting. After those movements, by the end of the 1800s, there was a nationalist movement in China. And this guy, Chiang Kai-shek, led the nationalist movement. The nationalists wanted China to assert control over its own affairs. They wanted to get rid of the imperialist Western powers. And this guy started a civil war, and he defeated the emperor. And so they became the main power in China in 1911. Now, he was kind of on friendly terms with the U.S. The nationalists tended to admire the U.S. for its democracy and its institutions. In World War II, in fact, China was our ally against the Japanese. But after World War II, something happened. The communists took over the country, and the nationalists had to flee to an island off the coast of China called Taiwan. So when the communists came over, we feared that they would partner with the Soviet Union and spread communism around the world. So we were no longer good friends with China. There was also something that shows you Taiwan, where the nationalist government fled. In 1949, there was the Korean War, and China and the U.S. were in direct conflict during this war. China supported the North Koreans, and the U.S. supported the South Koreans. In that war, 250,000 Chinese died, and 54,000 Americans died. So lots of casualties in this direct conflict between China and the U.S. But after a couple of decades, China and the Soviet Union started to not get along so well. And so we thought maybe we could get along with the Chinese better, since we had this mutual suspicion of the Soviet Union. So President Nixon, who was a big-time anti-communist, nevertheless went over and met with the communist leader of China. And there's Mao again. And this started a new phase where we started to have better relationship with China. Mao soon passed away after this meeting, and Nixon had to resign from office. But a new leader in China named Deng Xiaoping came and visited America. And he went to a rodeo in Texas, and he wore this hat. And when he wore this hat, it really was a signal that there was a change between China and the U.S. and that we were now going to try to get along much better. In fact, Deng also instituted reforms to the Chinese economy, where they were no longer staunch communists. So he started turning the Chinese economy into a capitalist economy, which of course we like that. So finally, there's one sticking point though. Even though we are on much better terms with China today, ever since that meeting with Mao, the sticking point, well, there are a couple of sticking points. A big one is the country of Taiwan. Ever since the nationalists fled there, China has claimed Taiwan as part of their country, but Taiwan has claimed independence. And the U.S. has guaranteed the security of Taiwan. So we've sided with Taiwan, and that's been a little tricky when it comes to our relationship with China. In fact, in 2017, President Trump said that we might send our Navy to Taiwan for a visit, and that was really distressing to the Chinese because they do not want our Navy in their country. So there you have it. That's a brief overview of the history of U.S.-China relations. It started out really rocky with the Chinese being sold opium and being defeated in a war. And now it's improved ever since Nixon met with Chairman Mao. All right, if you have any questions, let me know in class.